Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So today I would like to start on narrative. This is the first major writing style or method of development that we'll be learning about this semester. So you might remember back in week 1, I mentioned that we will be going through several different writing styles this semester. We'll be learning about different types of writing and how to do them successfully. So that begins with narrative, and for each different type that we study, we're going to be looking at examples in 50 essays. So hopefully we all have the book by now. You have 2 pieces to read by the end of this week: Salvation by Langston Hughes and Shooting an Elephant by George Orwell. These are both great examples of first-person narratives, and you'll have a chance to talk about them in this week's discussion post. So make sure to complete the reading and then check out my prompt for the week 2 discussion post. You'll get to choose which essay you discuss, and I'm looking forward to reading those. So let's just go over some of the basics when it comes to narrative here today. I want to go over some of the basic elements of narrative, some of the most common characteristics or features that we expect to find in narratives. So we'll go over the basics, and then next week, in week 3, we'll get a little bit more in depth and we'll add a little bit more to our knowledge. But I like to start with narrative. I like for it to be our first writing style that we study, because most people are already pretty familiar with this style of writing. We see narratives all around us all the time. And of course, a narrative is simply a story. So when we are telling or writing a narrative, we are merely telling a story. So we often associate this term with fiction. We hear narrative and we think novels, maybe short stories, maybe graphic novels, maybe we think movies, TV shows, and sure, those are all really good examples of narratives, and those are usually fictional narratives, meaning they are made up. But of course, not all narratives have to be fiction. If you're a fan of true crime documentaries, those are also forms of storytelling. Those are very much narrative, but they're based on real events. So narratives can be true, they can be totally made up, they can be at least loosely based on real people's experiences or real life events, or again, they can be completely the figment of someone's imagination. But whether it's fiction or nonfiction, we're going to find a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same features in pretty much any narrative we ever read. So like I said, narratives are everywhere. I've just mentioned some of the most common examples of narrative that we see in our everyday lives, but just think about newspaper stories or any kind of news story that you might read online. I know most of us don't read traditional newspapers anymore, but just think about any news story, any online article that you might have read recently. They're almost always presented in narrative form. Even if it's just an article about, celebrity gossip or sports or music, virtually all forms of popular journalism are delivered in the form of stories. And there's a reason for this. Narrative is one of the most common, one of the most popular, and one of the most effective types of writing that we have. And there have been studies done that show that readers tend to remember things better when the information is presented as a narrative. Not only do we remember better with narratives, we also have a better chance to relate to whatever it is we're reading, because perhaps we share certain experiences with the characters in the text, or maybe we at least know a little bit about what's going on in that text, even if the events are foreign to us, even if the experiences are very remote from our own experiences. just the nature of a narrative, the fact that it's people doing things, it allows us to put ourselves there. It allows us to kind of imagine that we are participating in these events, that we are a character in the story. So we can relate better, we can remember better when the information is presented as a narrative, and we can better understand what we've read when it's presented as a narrative. So you'll notice that even when we're looking at other writing styles, even when we're looking at different kinds of writing that have, different purposes, different functions, different roles, we're still going to see traces of narrative. We're still going to see some examples of narrative writing because it is so effective. So when I teach argumentative writing, and I really emphasize this in 102, we talk about utilizing certain elements of narrative when we're writing argumentative research papers. So obviously the whole thing can't be one big narrative, but we can bring in little mini narratives. We can tell little brief stories that serve as examples or evidence and can help to support our larger claims. So even in a type of writing like that, there is still a place for at least a brief narrative. So this is a really good type of writing to master. This is a really good type of writing to be comfortable with. Not just so you can tell stories and entertain people, although that's certainly nice, but also because you can use elements of narrative in all kinds of different writing situations, all kinds of different scenarios. So let's just go through some of the most common elements today and just talk a little bit about some of the most important aspects of narrative. But just remember that this type of writing has been around basically as long as recorded history, actually a little bit longer. If you guys look in the week 2 module, you'll notice that I've posted a video clip. You don't have to watch the whole thing, but if you have time, take a look because it is very interesting. I just grabbed this from a PBS show, and it's about prehistoric cave art. So we're talking about cavemen, cave people, prehistoric people. So we're going way back in time and finding some of the first real examples of narrative, some of the earliest examples of storytelling in human history. So we're going back before the dawn of civilization. We're going back before writing systems had even been created. So in that video, if you watch it, you'll notice that we're in France and the host is taking us on a tour of some of these ancient cave drawings that they recently discovered in these caves in France. So I won't get too far into it. You can watch it for yourself, but there's a really interesting exchange early in that clip when the host of the show is sort of going through a guided tour of these caves. And the tour guide, who's a French guy, he's kind of hard to understand. He has a very thick accent, but the host of the show, Rick Steves, asks the tour guide if one of these drawings that they're looking at, one of these really big, elaborate drawings that they're looking at, he asks, "Oh, is this a hunting scene?" He asks the French tour guide, is this a depiction of a hunting scene? Is this basically what a big hunt would have looked like back in prehistoric times? Because the picture mostly consists of animals, like woolly mammoths and, I don't know, deer and horses and all of these other animals that the cave people would have been familiar with. But the answer the tour guide gives is very interesting because we might expect that this would be a hunting scene. This would be some event or image from the cave people's everyday lives that they're trying to sort of bring to life through their art. So that might be our initial assumption or our knee-jerk reaction. But the tour guide tells Rick Steves, no, actually, this is not a hunting scene, and we know it's not because there are no people in the drawing. There are no hunters. So if it was a hunting scene, we would see people along with the animals. We would see people with like spears or nets or whatever they use to kill these big animals. So the tour guide says, no, this is something more complex. This is not merely a representation of an everyday event. This is something more. Something a little bit more difficult for us to understand. And I've read a little bit more about cave paintings, and some historians think that a lot of these drawings were actually representations of dreams. So they were the artists' attempts to express their dreams, to express the weird things that they dreamed about. So there's this idea that maybe this is really the origin of this human impulse for storytelling, because we've been doing it forever. We have this strong drive, this really strong desire to tell stories to one another. Some stories are long, some stories are short, some are funny, some are tragic, but we do this a lot, and narrative has been around forever. And you guys know, I mean, virtually all literary traditions that we know of can be traced back to this basic core need to tell stories. So the ancient epics of Sumeria or Greece, that comes from the same impulse that drove the cave people. But as humans advanced and as civilizations sprang up and we developed systems of writing, the types of narratives that we told kind of shifted. So in the early days, pretty much all narratives were probably oral, or stories that were told out loud, or they were drawn in a visual art format. So we know that, for example, the Iliad and the Odyssey, ancient Greek epics, were probably originally oral literature. They were recited out loud, perhaps even performed in a more physical, visual way, and only later were they set down on paper. So narratives have, of course, changed and evolved over time, but we've always valued them. We've always used them, and they've been around even longer than recorded history. So that's kind of cool. That video really sort of drives home the fact that narratives really are a core part of who we are as humans. So let's just go through some of these key elements, beginning with narrative point. So as I point out, and I give you definitions for all of these in the week 2 overview, but as I point out, with the narrative point, this is just essentially the thesis of a narrative. And this can be a little bit tricky for some because we often associate a thesis statement with more traditional academic writing. So when it comes to comparisons or argumentative writing, we might expect to find a thesis because we think of a thesis typically as being an argument. And when it comes to narrative, we might think, well, there's not really an argument here. And yeah, maybe not. But for us, we can think about the thesis in a more broad sense. The thesis is simply the overall point, the main idea, the main takeaway that you sort of want your audiences to have and to leave with once they've finished your narrative. So there's always going to be a narrative point for all the narratives that we read, and then of course the narratives that we write. There's always going to be a point. There's always going to be a larger purpose beyond just entertainment value. Okay, so again, all stories have some kind of a point. They have some kind of larger message or meaning. And oftentimes, if we're talking about fiction, novels or short stories, we're often going to use the term theme. We're often going to say the theme of a story is basically the message, the larger point, the key sort of idea that the author is trying to get across. We don't always use the term theme as much when we're talking about nonfiction, but it can still apply. So we can say theme, we can say thesis, or we can say narrative point, or we can just say the main idea, because they're all pretty much saying the same thing here. They're all pretty much interchangeable. And here's one more thing to keep in mind when you're considering the narrative point. Again, narratives are a little bit different than more traditional forms of academic writing. So typically with classic academic writing, we want to clearly state our thesis. We don't want any ambiguity when it comes to what the thesis is and where it's located in our writing. But narratives are more creative in nature. They have fewer rules. They're a little bit more open-ended. So with narratives, sometimes that overall point is going to be explicitly stated in the text, just like a thesis statement would be in a research paper. Sometimes that's going to be the case, but other times that thesis, it exists, it's functioning, it's at work, but it might not be clearly stated. And this is especially true with fiction. You guys know, you've all read fiction in your lives. When you're reading a novel or a short story or even a narrative poem, the author is not, and frequently does not, just come right out and say, hey, the overall point of Harry Potter is blank. My larger message that I'm trying to get across here is blank. Authors don't typically do that with fiction, although there are some exceptions. But when we're looking at nonfiction, essays, maybe an article in a news magazine or a newspaper, yeah, sometimes the thesis will be clearly stated in those kinds of narratives. So it just depends. It depends on what we're looking at. It depends on the author of that piece and what the author likes to do and sort of how the author likes to work. So when you guys write your own narratives in a few weeks, you're going to decide if you want to clearly state your thesis and make it really clear and obvious, or if you want to leave it unsaid and you want to let your readers figure it out for themselves. Either option is fine, but you need to know what the thesis is. You need to clearly state it to yourself, even if you don't necessarily announce it to your audience. So we'll talk more about that. And of course, when we're talking about the text that we read, when we're analyzing some of these examples of narrative that we see in our book, we're going to need to identify the theme or the larger point, the larger message of these texts. And keep in mind, there can be a lot of different purposes, a lot of different messages. There's really no limit to what kinds of different points or meanings might be at work. You can have a lot of different intentions or a lot of different purposes behind a narrative. Sometimes narratives are meant to persuade. Sometimes they're meant to convince readers of a particular thing. Sometimes they are primarily meant to inform. Sometimes they are primarily meant to entertain. They might be largely comic or fun or lighthearted, but they still have a point. They still have a meaning or a message, even if it might be relatively simple or straightforward. But in a lot of cases, narratives are designed to make readers feel certain things, to make readers think certain things, and in certain cases, to make readers do certain things. So narratives, like all types of writing, they do real work in the world. They're not just ornamental, they're not just decoration, they're not just for fun, although they can be. They also do real work in many ways, as we will see. All right, so moving on, let's just talk about the central conflict a little bit. Almost all narratives will have a central conflict. This is the main source of tension or drama. This does not necessarily have to be a fight or a confrontation. There can be lots of different sorts of conflict. Some are really obvious and easy to see, like maybe in a superhero movie where you have the hero battling against the villain with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. That's a pretty central conflict, a pretty easy conflict to identify. But in other narratives, the conflict might be more subtle. It might be a little bit quieter, but it's still important. So again, just like there's all sorts of different narrative points, there can be all different kinds of conflict. But I'll give you some of the basic categories that we typically think of when we're thinking about conflict. So there's, of course, human versus human conflict, and this can encompass a large number of things. So interpersonal conflict, tension between individuals or between groups of individuals. There's all kinds of different combinations that you can find, but certainly lots of human versus human conflict in the world. But there's also human versus nature. So some stories might feature humans battling against the elements, humans trying to survive natural disasters, or humans lost at sea, or anything involving sort of crazy weather or really difficult sort of conditions or natural phenomenon, natural disasters. We see disaster movies. This can be a staple of a certain kind of film. So that's another kind of conflict that we can track. Also, human versus society. So this can be a little bit more tricky, but this can be an individual battling against larger institutions, maybe like a school or a government or maybe a military. This is a person maybe trying to break free from oppressive institutions or unfair or evil institutions, or it could be a person who's rejecting certain aspects of society, a person that wants to live off the grid, a person that wants to get off social media, a person that wants to throw away their cell phone. Those could be forms of conflict, and those could be seen as one person kind of struggling against the larger society or struggling against certain standards or conventions that are valued by that society. There can also be internal conflict. Sometimes the conflict in a narrative is not between the main character and somebody else or something else. Instead, it's an internal conflict. It might be really a struggle that's taking place primarily in somebody's brain, in somebody's head. It could be a person versus him or herself in certain ways. So that's another type of conflict that we might see. In fact, I would say in Salvation, the Langston Hughes piece, we're going to see several forms of conflict, but there might be some internal conflict going on there as Hughes is, sort of having a certain battle or a struggle with himself. He's also experiencing a conflict with maybe the larger society that surrounds him, but there's internal conflict as well. So look for that when you're reading Salvation. All right, so hopefully that all makes sense so far. Now let's talk about setting. I think most of us are familiar with what setting means. We're talking here about the time and the place of a narrative. So there really are two levels of setting that you need to be aware of. There's physical setting, and this will typically have to do with the geographical location, like where in the world are we? What country are we in? What state are we in? What city or town are we in? We can even get more specific. Maybe we're in a particular neighborhood. We're on a particular street. We're in somebody's house. So those are all aspects of the physical setting. But there's also what we call the temporal setting or the time-based setting. So this means, what time period are we in? Is this narrative taking place in the present day? Is it happening right now in 2021? Or Is it set in the future? That's often true with science fiction or fantasy narratives. They might take place in some futuristic universe. Or are we going back in time? Are we going to the past? Are we telling a narrative that's set back in the 1800s, for example? So there are these two different levels of setting. Sometimes only one will really be established. So maybe the author doesn't tell us the time period, but we know that we're in Arizona. But we don't know exactly if it's modern day or if it's a little bit in the past. Sometimes, though, there will be clues. So again, authors don't spell things out for you all the time in narrative. Sometimes things are left to the reader to figure out. So you have to use context clues sometimes to figure out the setting, to figure out the time period. Sometimes the author might drop hints based on the way people dress, or the music that people listen to, or the cars that people are driving. If you're reading a narrative in which nobody has cell phones and people aren't logged on to the internet all day, then you're probably back in the 90s. Like, that tells you that it's not the 2000s if the internet isn't everywhere. If we're going back, to the 80s or the 70s, that might be made clear through music, clothes, other aspects of the time period. So you just have to keep an eye out for some of those clues. But other times the author will just tell us. It was June 1988 in Las Vegas, and then we know. But you have to figure out not only what the setting is, or you have to pay attention when you're told what the setting is, but you also have to figure out what kind of impact does the setting have on the events that we see. How does the setting affect the characters? How does the setting perhaps affect or influence that larger narrative point or thesis that we were just talking about? So the setting has a lot of importance that you have to uncover beyond just knowing where we are in terms of geography and time. But make sure you do that. Make sure you're aware of both of those levels of setting. I'm going to come back to detailed description, but let's move on to characters. Again, we know what this term means. The characters are the people that inhabit the narrative. Most narratives will have characters, whether the story is fiction or nonfiction. So typically there will be a main character, and we usually call this person the protagonist. So this is the person that we follow, this is the person that we spend most of our time with, and this is the person that might get the most attention from the author. We also typically have an antagonist. So the protagonist is kind of the hero, if we're thinking about this in simple terms. So that means the antagonist is sort of the villain. But keep in mind, a lot of narratives are very complex. And as we know, most humans are very complex. So we don't find a lot of 100% heroes or 100% villains. So even if we're dealing with an antagonist in a story, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person's bad or evil in every way. It just means that that person is somehow in the way of the protagonist. That the antagonist is blocking the protagonist or preventing the protagonist from accomplishing certain things or acquiring certain things that the protagonist wants. So again, a lot of times that's going to be one of the key conflicts at work. But sometimes the antagonist might be doing that unintentionally, or it might not really be a confrontation. It's not a fist fight. It's not a battle between good versus evil. Not every time. Sometimes it might be more complex. But those are some of the most common character types that we can identify. The protagonist, an antagonist, maybe the antagonist is a group of people or an institution, or maybe it's the ocean. It doesn't have to be just one individual person. But we can usually identify protagonist, antagonist, and then we're going to spot a lot of supporting characters. The friends and family of the protagonist, co-workers, associates. There's going to be a larger cast, typically. of characters. Some will be important, some will be less so. Some might be there primarily for comic relief. Others might have different duties or responsibilities, but we just need to think about the characters and form opinions about them. Also, if you're going to have characters and those characters talk to one another, that means you're also going to have dialogue. So dialogue is basically just recorded conversations, the spoken words of characters. Now, not every narrative will have dialogue, but even if you're reading a newspaper article or something online, if the reporter quotes anybody, if the reporter actually sits down and talks to the subject of the interview, you might see some dialogue. You might see some things that the famous person actually said in response to the reporter's questions. Or maybe the reporter listens to the person talk to somebody else and relays some of that conversation. So dialogue's pretty common, but we're not always going to see it. It doesn't have to be there for the narrative to work, but it's a pretty common feature, especially if we're reading fiction. Again, in novels, short stories, we frequently see dialogue, at least small bits of it. Let's move on to key events. So this is easy. The key events, in other words, what happens in the narrative. You can think of the key events as basically functioning as the plot. Most narratives have a plot. And like I was saying earlier, even when we're doing other things besides telling stories, we use elements of narrative because that makes the information easier for our readers to understand. This is especially true when it comes to a plot line. Think about how we consider our own lives. We think of our own lives typically as stories. And the things that happen to us, the events of our lives, well, that's the plot of our story. So we have various twists and turns, different shocking things, cliffhangers. Those are the events of our respective plots. So almost any narrative has a plot. Whether it's fiction, nonfiction, it doesn't matter. If it's an action movie, the plot will consist of a lot of fighting and explosions, and the hero's gonna beat up bad guys and shoot them and save the day and probably rescue people, maybe small children, maybe a wife or a girlfriend, or that's changing a little bit, but usually they're gonna rescue people in distress, defeat the bad guys. There's lots of explosions and running. So that's going to be a typical action plot. But a different kind of narrative will obviously have a very different type of plot. Some plots don't have a lot of action in terms of explosions or fight scenes. The plot might consist of the protagonist going to work or sitting around and talking to other people, but it's still a plot. It might not be the most exciting plot, but it's still a plot. So when you start working on your own narratives, you have to figure out the key events that you want to depict. And then once you've identified the key events of your plot, the next step is to work on the narrative sequence. So you have to ask yourself, okay, well, how are these events of my plot going to unfold? How am I going to present them? And you have a lot of options when you're figuring out sort of the organization or the sequence of your plot. So as I mentioned in the week 2 module, you can use a chronological sequence. This means that things happen from beginning to end, and you're going in order from, oldest to most recent. You're moving from beginning to end. A lot of authors do that, especially with nonfiction, if we're trying to make things clear and straightforward. But you're also going to notice in some narrative that the authors like to use non-chronological sequences. Sometimes authors like to use flashbacks or flash forwards. So we're going back in time, or maybe we're going forward in time. Sometimes we might start at the end, and we might go in reverse chronological order. At other points, we might start in the middle and we might double back to the beginning and then at some other point move forward into the future. So there's lots of different kinds of narrative sequences. As you guys probably know, if you guys watch movies or watch shows or read really any kind of written narrative, you'll see that there are lots of different ways to present the major events of a plot. You don't have to use chronological order. You can do a lot of fun things with time, jumping back and forth to different points in time. But you need to work all of that out when you're putting together your own narrative. But of course, using chronological order is fine. Lots of authors still do that. Then the final key term for this week is point of view. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because this is very important. Well, these are all important terms, but point of view is very important to think about once you start trying to create your own narrative. You need to decide what kind of point of view you'll want to use in your own work. All narratives have a narrator. The narrator is the person telling the story. But there are a lot of different kinds of narrators. Some narrators are reliable and trustworthy. Some are not. Sometimes the narrator is a character in the story. Sometimes it's not. So you have a lot of options here. Typically, the most common points of view that we see in narrative is first person and then third person. So let's talk about first person. This is often what we find in personal narratives. This is usually revealed by the use of the first person pronoun. I did this. I did that. This happened to me. So I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of a hint. As you look at Hughes and Orwell this week, you'll notice that they are both using a first-person narration style. They're both telling their own stories. This happened to me. I did this. So that's very common in both fictional and non-fictional narratives. But in this case, the author is also sort of playing the role of narrator. But this can get tricky because sometimes the I in the text, in the story, isn't the exact same as the author. So think about Salvation for a moment by Langston Hughes. Hughes is writing that story. It's about himself. At least it would appear to be. It's about an experience that he had as a child, as a young person. So think about that. Hughes is writing the narrative as an adult, but he's relating experiences that he had as a kid. So yeah, he's telling his own story, but the narrator of the story might be a little bit different than the adult version of Hughes who wrote the story. And that might be at work with Orwell too. Orwell's talking about stuff that really happened to him. Real experiences that he had. But he had those experiences as a young man. Not a kid, but a young guy like in his 20s. And then he writes the story years later in a different place in life. So is the author the exact same as the narrator in the story? Maybe. But maybe not. That's part of the fun. As readers, we get to decide some of that. That's part of the fun. But anyway, a first-person narrative is usually pretty easy to identify. So you have the narrator talking about him or herself, relating things, experiences, events that occurred to him or herself. Now, with third-person narration, we're doing something different. So with a third-person style, we're not telling our own story necessarily. With third person, we're going to use third-person pronouns. So instead of I did that, now John did that. Anne did that. he said that. This happened to her. So we're creating a little bit more distance now between the narrator and the events that the narrator is describing. So we can see different types of third-person narrators. The most common type, though, is what we call an omniscient narrator. And you guys probably learned a lot of these terms previously in school. You probably learned about an omniscient third-person narrator. This is a godlike narrator. This is a narrator that's not typically a character in the text, but this is a narrator that seems to know everything, or at least a lot of things, about all of the characters. So an omniscient narrator is all-knowing, godlike. So that omniscient narrator can tell you what any character is thinking, can tell you what any character is doing or has done or will do. There's really no limit to the potential knowledge of an omniscient third-person narrator. But other third-person narrators might be more limited. They're not omniscient. So some third-person narrators are only able to tell you about the protagonist's thoughts and feelings. Or they might only have access to certain characters' inner thoughts and feelings and fears and dreams. They might not be able to access all of the characters. So a more limited third-person narrator might not function like an omniscient narrator. Sometimes another character, not the main character, but a supporting character, might be telling the story. And that could sometimes lead to a first-person style if they're telling it from their own perspective, or they could use a third-person style if they're sort of removing themselves from the action. Because that's the key with third-person narration. Typically, a third-person narrator is not directly involved in a lot of these major events of the plot. That's because it's an omniscient narrator that exists kind of above this fictional world, or it might be a limited third-person narrator who we just never see. We just never meet this person or see this person. They are simply there to tell us the story. So we'll talk more about different points of view as we look at more examples in the weeks to come. The final thing I'll mention now is detailed descriptions. Later, we're going to work more on descriptive language. How do we bring our descriptions to life? But for now, just remember that descriptions of all kinds are very important for narrative writing. So when you're writing a narrative, you're going to want to describe a lot of things: people, objects, places, various sensory impressions or images. I asked you guys to think about images when you were thinking about your songs back in week 1. So descriptive writing really helps to make images come alive. So I believe it's week 4. We're going to do more descriptive work. So we're going to really focus on strong verbs and vivid adjectives, how to make our descriptions really pop off the page. But we're not quite there yet. So let's not worry too much about descriptions just yet. We'll get to those more in week 4. So for this week, just be sure to read Salvation and Shooting an Elephant. And then in week 3, we're going to keep working with narrative. We're going to look at a couple more examples, and we're going to get a little bit more in depth. So I'll see you next week. Email me in the meantime if you have any questions.